Okay. I see you. Perfect. And now I'm going to give you this. And I'm going to take this back. Okay.
It's been my honor to serve on the board of the ACLU of Illinois. Is that on?
Wait, I put it real close.
It's been my honor to serve on the board of the ACLU of Illinois. I've been a member of the ACLU since I was in college, which is now several years ago. But I have never seen a period in our nation's history where civil liberties were under attack the way they are now. And we are very fortunate to have as a speaker today Ed Yohnka, who is the Director of Communications and Public Policy of the ACLU of Illinois. Ed?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Scott and Vanessa, and it's really great to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit about how we view what's happening around civil liberties and civil rights in our country, a little bit about what the ACLU of Illinois is doing. But candidly, I also want to talk a little bit about what we all need to do in this moment. And I always feel the need, I don't know if it's validation, but I always feel the need in these kinds of presentations to talk a little bit about the fact that the ACLU, for all that we are criticized, is actually a nonpartisan organization. We were formed 106 years ago at a time when people were concerned about infringements upon civil rights and civil liberties, and people from across the country, including right here in Chicago, came together to join forces to fight what they saw as efforts to suppress civil rights. And in the more than 100 years that we have operated, we have ended up suing every single occupant of the Oval Office. I will tell you, that got a little rough for some of us after 2008, because many of us had friends who were working in the White House, and they were not afraid to call us and tell us that they didn't want us to sue them. But in many ways, this particular president and this particular administration create a different kind of threat to civil liberties than an issue here or an issue there with which we disagree. And so, I am fond of saying, mostly to my family members who support the president and say to me, well, you guys are just a left-wing Democratic organization. I always point out that no, we're an organization that supports democracy, and it's not my fault that the administration is fleeing from it. Because I have to say that, while I have had broad disagreements, the ACLU, as I say, has had a disagreement with administrations over the course of my lifetime. We have never had a presidency and an administration which has attempted to rule as an authoritarian, which has attempted to literally strike out and strike down the fundamentals of our democracy. And we see that in a number of different ways. I want to just talk at the top. I'm going to talk about some areas that you've heard about, but I want to talk about one thing that just has been in the news in the last few weeks, and that is that around the Department of Defense and an AI contract with a company called Anthropic. I see some nods of the head, so some of you know about this, but to level set, the Department of Defense had previously signed a $200 million a year contract with a company called Anthropic to provide AI services to the Department of Defense. And it is, by the way, still the Department of Defense. And but the Department of Defense decided that they wanted to change some of the terms of the contract this year, as government is able to do. And they said that, among other things, they wanted to lift some guidelines that Anthropic had insisted on being in the contract. And those guidelines were, number one, that their AI product could not be used for the mass surveillance of Americans. And number two, that their product could not be used to create automated weapons that would launch fire or do damage against property or individuals without a human making the decision. Those were their provisions. And the Department of Defense couldn't agree to that. And they told Anthropic they had to either change their contract or they were going to lose it. That's a decision that a business is going to make. And Anthropic decided that, in fact, they were not going to succumb to the demands of the Department of Defense. But the Department of Defense, in response, didn't simply end the contract. They labeled the company a supply chain risk, which puts them at risk of not being able to work with any other company who does business not only with the DoD, but with any government agency. So in other words, the lesson was you either succumb and give in to capitulate to all of our demands, or we will destroy your company. And that is the kind of thing that in other countries or in other places we would view as being steps towards authoritarianism. But we're seeing this attack in a number of other areas. For example, the administration and the White House and the Office of Management and Budget in particular simply believes that the Congress has no role in determining how funds are allocated, appropriated, and spent by the federal government. I realize that maybe some of you, I will say, for the first time in 45 years, I figured this out. For the first time in 45 years last week, I did not watch the State of the Union message. I decided for my mental health that I wasn't going to do it. But the reality is that, I have been told, and I've actually now seen the video, there was a moment at which the president announced that he was going to, in the wake of the Supreme Court decisions, do other tariffs, and quote, he did not need Congress. And the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the third in line to be the president, the leader of the legislative branch in the United States, stood up and applauded. And I think it is that kind of just ceding of power that has led the administration to believe that they can simply spend money or block spending in ways that they want to, with or without congressional authorization. We see this in a couple of ways. There is, first of all, as we saw early on in the administration, the effort simply to stop funding and doing particular things, whether it is, destroying programs like Head Start or the Department of Education broadly, whether it was their efforts to put a block on all funding for childcare and childcare assistance in 5 states where they suggested that somehow there was some sort of fraud, but which they were never able to prove. Now, those kinds of things often are blocked by the courts. But there's a different way, and many of these have been, but there's a different way in which this administration has used the funding mechanism, and that is to try to coerce other governmental agencies, especially at the state and local level, to comply or to align with their values around policy and practices. We see, for example, the way in which the administration has sued the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, and Cook County over our policies regarding immigration, particularly the fact that in immigration, Illinois has a state law. Chicago and Cook County have calorie acts or calorie ordinances or measures that simply say that local police will not participate in immigration activities, in the enforcement of federal civil immigration law in our communities. Now, the administration, as you know, says that they can't do that they have to comply and abide by the administration's requirements for the way in which our local and state officers are going to engage in that activity. And in fact, they say that they're arguing this, to try to improve public safety. I will just tell you that there are a number of peer-reviewed studies from the last several years that look at counties that have so-called sanctuary policies. When you look at violent crime, those counties actually are safer than the ones that don't. But the administration has attempted to cut off funding to Illinois, to Cook County, to the city of Chicago, to other communities around the country that adopt these policies, and actually at times have sued to try to force our local and state police to engage in immigration enforcement alongside of the feds. Those have not been upheld by courts. In many instances, have been knocked out pretty quickly. But it is the kind of thing that we see. But it isn't around just immigration policy. The president has threatened to cut off all federal funding and grants that go to any Illinois law enforcement agency because the state of Illinois has adopted a cash or no cash bail system across our state. As you know, we adopted this a few years ago. It went through litigation up to and including the Illinois Supreme Court. The measure has now gone into effect. And despite claims, including remember those really fun commercials where Illinois was going to become like the movie The Purge if we didn't have cash bail. What we see is that violent crime rates in the state of Illinois actually continue to fall since that measure was put into place. But the president insists that unless those policies are in place, the public is not safe and has threatened to cut off those funds.
Very hard, the cash bond, very, very hard, and just something for us all to know and to see that it's a good outcome.
And lastly, I will just mention that one last spending bit I want to talk about, because I think this one has gotten a lot less attention than the others, is that in Illinois, as in other states, we have something called the Healthcare Right of Conscience Act. And it's a very simple notion, which is that there are going to be institutions like hospitals, medical clinics, and others, as well as practitioners who are not going to want to provide particular kinds of care because they have either a religious or a conscience objection to them. It's long been recognized that those folks should not be forced to engage or give that care. This is mainly aimed at reproductive health care, but it's often broader than that in other kinds of care. Illinois made a change to our HICRA law a few years ago, in which we said that it was perfectly appropriate, especially for an institution, not to provide that care, but that they needed to let patients know that the care was available, number one, and where they reasonably might get to it. And in one of my favorite moments in a legislative hearing and ever around that, somebody kept saying, but how will people know? How will people know? How will people know? And somebody finally said, couldn't they just tear a page out of the phone book? Another legislator suggested that. And the people who were testifying were like, well, that would work. That would meet the requirements of the law. That tearing a page out of a phone book was not good enough for some who have sued and challenged the law over the last several years and have gotten the ear of the administration. And the Trump administration recently threatened to cut off all Medicaid funding to Illinois if we don't change that law. And putting aside the merits of the change that was made to HICRA, which I find modest and reasonable, the fact is that cutting off those funds would be destructive for healthcare all across the state of Illinois. And if I could just identify as somebody who grew up downstate, would really destroy healthcare there, most of all, in places that supported the president. But this level of trying to use that funding to coerce policy changes and to make everyone align to their vision of America has been a constant in this administration. I think the second thing that we see is having again, Congress has done very little to respond to these spending measures. And so one of the things that we've seen, of course, is that much of this has been taken to the courts. And as a result of that, we see the courts quite often holding the administration accountable, striking down certain executive orders, certainly the Supreme Court striking down the tariff scheme. And the reaction to that level of accountability on the White House and the administration is nothing but opprobrium from the president and from the White House. The president, in the wake of the tariff decision, announcing, that the people who voted for that, especially the people that he nominated who voted for that measure or who voted with the majority in the tariffs case, quote, should be ashamed for their families. I will say I regularly disagree with the Supreme Court on many of their decisions. I don't ever think I should talk about what Samuel Alito should feel about his family. Just that idea of being held to any kind of account or any kind of reckoning is something that in this kind of authoritarian bent, the administration is not really interested in doing. We see that kind of escape of attempts to escape from criticism and critique, often too, with the administration's attacks on free speech. Look, it's really easy in this vein, to talk about Jimmy Kimmel, right? The administration literally didn't like that Jimmy Kimmel made fun of the president. And so they used the power of the federal government in order to try to get him removed from television so that there wouldn't be someone there who would engage in that sort of critique or criticism. But we've also seen efforts across the country on the part of the administration, to label people, including, broad swaths of civil society and civil society organizations, either label them or threaten to label them as domestic terrorists simply because they engage in practices and in policies with which the White House and the administration disagrees. We've seen the attacks on universities and the attacks on law firms and the attacks on corporations. We've seen the president put his thumb on the scale this week of literally deciding who gets to buy a company that controls CNN because he wants to have a say in how the news coverage of his administration is directed from those studios. This is a president who said on his inauguration day that free speech had come back to America with his election. And it's clear that free speech only means that people who are willing to praise him. And the last place that I want to talk about where we really see, these kinds of efforts at I think what is an authoritarianism is, of course, the way in which the administration has gone about its immigration activities across the country. ICE now has a budget after the Reconciliation Act last summer. ICE's budget every year is now bigger than the budget that we give to the United States Marine Corps. It is a larger budget than the armies of France and Germany. And the result of that budget is that people have been recruited and trained in 47 days because he's the 47th president of the United States. That's all it takes, of course, and put onto our streets and encouraged to go around the streets of the United States masked and heavily armed in order to engage in enforcement of immigration policies that they could not possibly have learned or understood in those 47 days. We have a case at the ACLU of Illinois. It actually grew out of a consent decree, a court agreement with the federal government that we'd won after the first Trump administration, in which it limits the ability of ICE agents and Customs and Border Protection agents to make arrests in the Chicagoland area, in Illinois, and in other states in the Midwest without a warrant. Of the several thousand people who were arrested during Operation Midway Blitz, we quickly, in looking at the files, identified nearly 1,000 people who were arrested without warrants. What would generally happen is ICE agents would go out, they would see someone, they would question them, they would take them into a custody, put them in the back of a car, they would ask them a series of questions, and then they would fill out the warrant on the site. And sometimes their approach was simply, where they were, that they were in a place where day workers were, day laborers were working. They were, they appeared to speak Spanish. In some instances were the justifications for even initiating the conversation. The sad thing is that we've been able through the courts to work through, a number of these instances and actually reveal and unearth evidence to show that these people were unlawfully arrested and detained. But the reality is that more than half of them have already been deported by the time we're able to do that. And of course, as we know that this force that has been unleashed on our city streets across the country has also turned that same threat and that same recklessness, not just on non-citizens, but on citizens and people who are simply protesting. The best estimates are that more than 100 United States citizens have been arrested and detained unlawfully by ICE during their operations in the past year. We know here in Chicago, as we saw, whether it was at the Broadview Processing Center or whether it was on the streets of Chicago or other places around Chicagoland, ICE agents would turn guns on people who were simply standing on the sidewalk, yelling at them, asking them what they were doing, why they were doing it, and if they had a warrant. We've seen repeated examples of ICE officers who have told people that they didn't have a right and could be arrested if they were recording the ICE officers while they were engaged in their practices, even though people are protected under the First Amendment for recording those activities. And in all of this, and I know there is the news this week that the Secretary of Homeland Security has been replaced. And I don't know that I ever thought we needed an MMA fighter as the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, but apparently I was just not thinking broadly enough. But I note that throughout all this, as we saw in Chicago and in Minneapolis, and even with the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, that at every step, the administration's first instinct was to lie about what was actually happening. Not to tell mistruths. There is no sugarcoating this. They have simply lied about what was happening. Sorry, like many of you, I've reached the age where I live my life by anecdote. So I'm going to just share one with you. This case I was talking about where we were seeking the dismissal of people, when the judge ruled that there was a group of 615 people that he would consider for release based on evidence that they were arrested without a warrant. I was talking that day to a number of different reporters, many of whom had been in the courtroom, and there was a lot of confusion about the math, and so we had to work all that out. But the most interesting part of that day was there was a reporter for the Washington Post who was working on the story, and she wasn't able to be in Chicago for the hearing, and she was going off of other accounts, and she finally decided at about 7 o'clock that night that she just wanted to call me. She said, "I don't usually do this, Ed, but I want to call you. I just want to read through what I have written, and you tell me if I'm capturing this or if there's any big glaring errors." And so she's reading through and she says, "Oh, and then I have a quote from Trish McLaughlin, who's the spokesperson for DHS." And she goes, "I'll skip over that." And I chuckled and I said, "Oh, no. You got to read to me what she said. I got to know." And her response was to talk about which president the judge had appointed the judge who was overseeing the case. And the second thing she said was, "and who is determined to release violent criminals out into the streets of Chicago who will do harm to American citizens." I had sat in that courtroom just that afternoon as the judge went to great lengths to say to the government, "Tell me if anybody on this list is dangerous, because I will not release them. But you've got to tell me." You know how many people they were able to come up with by the following week? 4 out of 615. So, what we've seen is this effort just to avoid any accountability by blaming others. And again, in a way that doesn't make us any safer. I will just say in this same case, literally last week, the judge ordered another group of people, about 13, released. 2 of those people were people who were detained at the infamous raid on South Shore, where they actually brought in military helicopters and filmed the whole thing for social media content. I raise all of this to say that there are issues that demand accountability, that demand a check, and Congress isn't doing it. And of course, when the courts do, then the courts get criticized. But one of the things that we're now seeing is, of course, and over the last few weeks, this drumbeat has gotten louder, is that the administration is seeking now to block the final check, which is what you do at the ballot box. You know, I'm going to say this, and I think I can say this without fear of contradiction. Our president has a very strange relationship with elections.
Well put.
Awesome.
When he wins, they're perfect. And even if he wins by a narrow margin, they provide him a mandate. When he loses, they were rigged and corrupt and horrible. And so, to be clear, all that we are hearing now about the steps that have to be taken to fix our elections for 2026 have nothing to do with 2024. They're all about 2020, which, wait for it, he lost. And so we're seeing these attacks on access to voting. You know, you see the administration attempting, and they're suing, among other states, Illinois, for all of the personal voter data, or all the personal data about every voter in Illinois, including your social security number and your driver's license number. The state of Illinois is pushing back. The ACLU has recently intervened in that lawsuit, along with allies in the voting rights area. And I think we are comfortable, given state and federal law, that will prevail and the government won't get access to that data. But not content with that, the president and his allies are now pushing the so-called SAVE Act. And I'm not sure what, they say it's the Save America Act. They added America recently to it. I'm not sure how this is supposed to save America, but it is really voter suppression in a significant way. Among other things, the SAVE Act would require that every person who registers to vote in the United States would have to have a document which proves their citizenship in order to register. There are two documents that do that. The first is a labeled, embossed birth certificate. The second is a passport. Now, the truth is, many of us have a passport, even if we don't still have access to our birth certificate, but not everybody. In fact, the estimates are that somewhere on the order of 5 million people across the state of Illinois do not have access to a passport. And in terms of the birth certificate, the reality is that, you know, for many people, they were born in another state. They may have to, there are some states that require you to actually physically be present in order to get that birth certificate document, because they're often used for identity theft. And so that's a measure that's been put into place, you know, and all of this costs money. There was a time in my lifetime when we passed a measure to end poll taxes. But the SAVE Act literally creates a poll tax for people across the United States by forcing them to get access to these documents in order to be able to register to vote. The second thing that the act does that's significant is that it says that if your name on your voter roll doesn't perfectly align with the name on that original foundational document, that you can be struck from the rolls.
For all the women, for all the women who changed their name, didn't change their name, it's a problem.
Yeah, I will just say I am you know, my name is Edwin Yohnka. My father's name was Edwin Yohnka. I do not like Edward, so I use Edwin all the time. But if I had registered to vote just as Ed and my birth certificate says Edwin, they could do that. Again, women who have changed their names when they've married but not changed their birth certificate. People who through adoption or adopting the name of a step parent along the way we see that. And here's the thing. We know how this plays out. The state of Kansas a few years ago adopted a measure like the SAVE Act for Kansas elections. And what happened is that over the 18 months that the law was in place, the measure actually resulted in 30% of eligible voters who attempted to register were denied registration. And if you think about that magnified across the country, it is cutting off a whole range of voters. And, lastly, it would do, damage to all of the efforts we've made in the state of Illinois to improve access to voting. It would end early voting. It would end automatic registration. It would end the wide use of mail-in ballots. Most recently, the president has said they have to pass the SAVE Act, and he's also now said that there has to be a measure attached to it to deny the ability of transgender students to play in sports. I'm still not sure what those 3 transgender kids who have waivers to play in sports in Illinois have to do with voting access, but apparently the president can make that connection. But here's the last thing I want to say about this is, of course, that the measure also includes a threat of criminal prosecution for any voting official, any county clerk, any registrar that registers someone who hasn't produced all these documents. And we know what that means. Nobody's going to get a break, right? If the question is close as to whether or not this document is appropriate or meets the test, they're always going to default to the side of not registering someone out of threat of criminal prosecution. This bill does not have enough votes in the Senate to pass. It passed narrowly in the House. But not content with that, the president's allies have a plan B, which is they have drafted a 17-page executive order and circulated it that would claim somehow that China meddled in the 2020 elections, and that as a result of that, the federal government needs to take over the elections in 2026. It would apply all of the provisions of the SAVE Act to this election, and one version of the order would actually require every registered voter in America to re-register with those documents before November. This is bad stuff. And it is simply, if you put that and add that to what's happening with the gerrymandering around the country, this is just an attempt in many ways to try to not have a change in the majority party in either house of Congress come this November. And I will just say as well, lest you think that whether it's the SAVE Act, whether it's the, whether it is, this executive order, that the ink won't be dry on these things before the ACLU and other people will be in court to challenge them. But part of this is that there is this attempt to continue to demonize and minimize the integrity of our elections. To say that the elections, that it must be that the administration is all powerful no matter what polls you see. And therefore, as the result, that we have to put these measures in place because we can only have an election that gives us that one single outcome. So the question is, at the end of this, what do we do?
Yes.
Like I said, first of all, let me say, the ACLU, including the ACLU, I've said we've sued every president in this administration alone since January 21st of last year, has filed 260 legal actions against this administration. And we're just getting started. If this comes up, we will file again. But I will say to you that if you hear nothing else today from me, know that there is no court order no legal decision that is going to save us from this. The only people coming to save us is us. And so we need to take action to fight against this. And let me give you 3 things that I think you can do. The first is, as I say, there is not the votes in the Senate to pass the SAVE Act. Both of our United States senators are opposed to it. I still think it's worth a call or a note to their office to thank them for opposing it and continuing and urging them to continue to do the same. The second thing is that I would hope that you would look for ways that you could play a role in the electoral system this year. For those of you who are inclined to do things like to become election judges, to make the system function more appropriately, you could do that. But the other thing is to not stand by when people just say, well, you know, every election is fixed. They're not. Voter fraud is a very rare thing. From the Cato Institute to the Brennan Center, from the right to the left, people who evaluate this work have found less than 25 instances of voter fraud from the last 8 years. That's out of millions and millions and millions of votes cast across this country. A non-citizen voting faces up to 5 years in prison. And they say that somehow they want to intimate that there's lots of that that's happening. We need to be voices to amplify against just this kind of thing, just this kind of talk. And the last thing I'll say, and you know, leave it to the guy in the suit and tie to bring this up, but you know, is we also need to be in the streets. I know I don't look like a street guy right now. But here's the thing. There is no question that America is sliding towards autocracy. The best political scientists in the world say that once a country begins that slide, it is just as likely to finish it by going into autocracy as to pull itself back. There is only one thing that stops the slide, and that's people power. It's people going out into the streets to protest the activities of the government. The No Kings rally that is coming up in 3 weeks on March 28th is the next best opportunity for us to do that. It scares this administration that so many people go out and protest. Last time, remember, they said we were all dangerous and violent. They'll say worse this time. But it is really important that that happens. And I know there's going to be an event here in Highland Park. It is really critical that people are out and part of those things. You know, let me say in closing, I think there are 2 phrases in the English language that there are the most beautiful use of the language that weren't written by William Shakespeare. The first phrase is pitchers and catchers report to spring training. You should invite me back, Scott, one day to just talk about baseball. I love baseball. But the second most beautiful phrase is we the people in order to form a more perfect union. You know, we were never promised that the union would be perfect. We were only promised that we would have the tools to work towards perfection. And I think that the reality of that in many ways is that the work was never going to be done simply by people we elected. It was never going to be done by people who were appointed to positions, including the Supreme Court of the United States. It was still always in our hands. And this moment calls for all of us to be involved in every way that we can in that work. And it's an opportunity to create the kind of future and the kind of community that we want for our children and for our grandchildren. With that, I will pause, say thank you, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. I saw you had your hand up. Did you get your question?
So I'm gonna go around.
Okay.
A couple of things first, you know, I'm the moderator. So first of all, you really set us up If you want to do something, we have postcards that are going out for primaries in other states and just to encourage them to vote. There's packets ready to go as you leave. And I was gonna say, the other phrase that I like is lo alecha machal ligmor. You're not obligated to finish the work, but you can't ignore it. So we have to get out there, and I think that was, because I'm nodding my head the whole time and saying, yes, 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 but we really have to do this. Okay, so the first question, all right, right here, and then I'll hold it.
Okay. I have two quick questions. The first question is, how is the administration going after the ACLU for going after them? The second question is, it seems to me that they're only going after blue states. Is there anything that can be done to say that this is unfair discrimination?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, we've heard rumors repeatedly that an order is coming that will attack organizations like the ACLU. We've never seen that. Essentially our response to that is we are being as responsible as we can. We are making certain we aren't engaged in any activity that could be questioned or used by the administration in any ways like that. But we're not stopping from doing the work. And the second one on the blue state one, that is actually an argument, which particularly just recently in the effort to block the child care subsidies, that was really powerful in the court argument when the AGs from those 5 states that were blocked went to court. They said, they seem to only be able to find fraud or claim fraud from states that didn't vote for the president. And I think that made a significant amount of difference. And it's one of the things that when when the facts are uncovered often in these cases, that the political nature of that come up, and then that becomes a significant factor.
We were recently in Guatemala, and we were on a tour, and we met a tour guide who had self-deported. He was driving to work. He looked the part. They pulled him over. He was here legally. He had documentation. He had documentation. ICE ripped up the documentation, arrested him, and then moved him around the country so his attorney could not find him.
Yeah.
And eventually, his attorney was able to tell him, you can fight this, but you're probably better off self-reporting and fighting it, trying to get back into it. That's the first one. The second one was a news article about a young woman driving in Waukegan. And she's a U.S. citizen. I think she was born here. She's a U.S. citizen. She got pulled over because she was flying Mexican flags on the car. And even though she was a citizen, she was arrested. She moved around. Eventually, she had to get released. I'm wondering if there's something we can do to keep their heads spinning so they don't know who to go after. In other words, why don't we take maybe a play out of the Danish playbook when the Danes all wore stars of David so that the Nazis could not identify who the Jews were? What if we all drove around with Honduran flags, Venezuelan flags, and Mexican flags on our car? So they spent so much time pulling cars over that when people who were clearly not immigrants, that they couldn't possibly do it.
Yeah.
Just keep them busy.
Yeah. I will say 2 things. Number one, the first story you told, and I think what's happening to people and the moving them around, keeping them away from counsel is something we regularly hear. And also the destruction or the seizure of documents or property and not giving it back is something that has been a feature as well. I think, in any kind of situation where the enforcement, and I feel like I should put quotes around that, is so chaotic and reckless, I think a lot of that is bound to happen. I think your second idea is a good one. I think that kind of thing is exactly the sort of organized community thing that could happen, because I think people, again, you're just If they're trying to find a needle in a haystack, the thing to do is to build a bigger haystack.
So how do we do that?
I think one of the things is first of all, there's a lot of the community groups, the rapid response groups and things like that have been formed that are created large lists of people in communities that are looking for something to do. I think taking those kinds of suggestions to them and urging them to telling that story and urging them to do that, I think is exactly the kind of thing that folks are looking for as we prepare for whatever the next round of this in the Chicago area looks like.
Is there a way to get it national? Could an organization like the ACLU?
I don't know that it's us, although that's it. Let me think about that a minute. I don't know. I don't know that I think it's us necessarily, but I think there are groups that could do it. Yeah.
How much of what Trump is doing is justifies he's an outlier, and what needs to be done because some law absolutely amendments to be passed to limit the power.
That's a really, that is a really good question. The question was, if in case anybody couldn't hear it, is how much of this is happening is because the current president is an outlier, and what do we need to do in terms of reining in the power of the presidency? There is no question that the power of the executive has been greatly expanded over recent years. And, it is clear now that this administration has taken that idea of a unitary executive, an all-powerful executive, and taken it to a new level. I'm always interested in many ways as I have conversations with members of Congress of the minority party who talk about what's the first thing we should do? What's the first measure we should look at? And I think that there are people who are cataloging, what that looks like. And it's true. I think there are things that we never thought of in our lives that we're going to have to do. For example, and I'll just say this, I think we always thought that if you were running for president of the United States, that it would just be a norm that you would have to release your tax returns for X number of years. It may be that you have to pass a law that says the minute you file your paperwork with the Federal Elections Committee to run for president, that has to be released. I think, for example, I always think of the fact that if it's a constitutional amendment or if there just needs to be an act of Congress, it cannot be that the framers and founders of this country who were moving away from a king intended to create immunity for the president of the United States from criminal charges. It can't be. It just simply doesn't hold up. So that's another thing that I think you have to think of. There may have to be specific acts that are either passed and or amended in order to provide the kind of independence to agencies that we've always anticipated. And I think that's one of those places where, again, we've always thought of. But there are some that are things that have just become tradition in many ways that I don't know that I don't know yet, what the fix looks like. The way in which the independence of the Department of Justice has been completely undermined. I think it's going to take a long time to build that back up and fix it. And I don't know it's a statute or a particular act as more of actions and courage on the part of people. So I think there's a long way to go, and there's probably 7 or 8 different ways that we're going to have to come at that problem and that issue.
I just want to let people know that Rabbi Serrana has he's gone to Broadview. He is protesting there. Also, we have a collection of rice, beans, and oil, neighbor to neighbor. We take it to the Unitarian Church, and they give it to 60 people who are afraid to go grocery shopping, who don't want to leave their home anymore. And if this escalates, it'll be even worse. Rob, real loud.
Walter Isaacson, the author, agrees with you about We the People, and he just wrote a book called The Greatest Sentence Ever Written.
Yes.
He talks about.
I said that before he wrote the book, but I do just want to say, I greatly admire Mr. Isaacson, but I do want to say I've said that for a long time.
Everything you said is so alarming. The most alarming thing, in my opinion, is which is what we were talking about the political sciences. We're saying when we're at the place where we are right now in the United States, there's an equal chance we slip totally into an autocracy or regain our place. My personal opinion is I think a lot of people in this country don't know what autocracy is. They don't understand what will happen if, in fact, this country becomes an autocracy. There will be no civil liberties, assets will be taken away, and other horrible things will happen. Is that under the purview of the ACLU to educate people as to what could happen? And maybe that will motivate more people to get out there and push back hard.
So the question is it under the purview of the ACLU to educate people in a more direct way about the threats of autocracy and what that means? I will say two things. I think the first thing is that it's sort of the reality of what we try to do every day when we talk about the things we do, right? When we talk about the legal challenges we take, when we talk about legislation we support or oppose, a lot of what we're doing is trying to do that educational work. It's often hard and complicated, by the fact that people, as I say, and I tell my colleagues this all the time, we start talking about the work we're doing, about conditions at Broadview, and everybody gets focused just on what's happening at Broadview, and it's really hard to broaden people's aperture out to, these larger things. So I think we have to look for every opportunity that we can, and we could do a better job of doing that, quite frankly. But I think the other element of this is, and I step a little bit outside of just the purview of the ACLU, which is that I think one of the other things is that we need other people across civil society to be doing this as well. And, I've been thinking a lot about, I'll just say this personally for a moment, I've been thinking a lot about these corporate titans who have bent the knee so much to the administration. My God, do they not understand that it's this system that has allowed all of this success? None of these people founded their companies in China. They founded them here. None of these companies have corporate headquarters in Moscow, right? They did it here. They did that because this was the place where that would work. And so for me, I think we need more, breaks. We need more defections from the corporate world, from other parts of society to reiterate these same messages. Because I think that's the part of this that ultimately, gets us to a place where it's just part of the, part of the fabric of the country. I think about, somebody was talking the other day, about, Heather Cox Richardson, who does a wonderful job of weaving these things together. But, even for her, it's a very small audience of people that she reaches. And just figuring out a way that not only is it dependent upon her or the ACLU or, any of our partner groups or allies, but that in fact, it's also folks from across, elected officials to, community members to others. And I think all of that is really important, is really important. So what I will say, I just want to, that question reminds me of something. And probably a frustrated, son of a elementary school teacher. And so therefore I believe I can assign homework to people. But some of this discussion at the end especially reminds me, I would point you all to a speech that the Vice President of the United States gave to the Claremont Institute a few months ago. And in the speech, Vice President Vance talked about what it means to be an American. And I will just share that he has a very different concept of it than I do. Because what he said was, you are more of an American if your forefathers going back 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 generations have been present in the United States. Even if, and he added this, even if they fought on the side of the Confederacy, then if you have come here in the last couple of generations, but you embrace all of the principles contained in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. I think when I think about what it means to talk about what democracy is, I think one of the things that I often think too is that we need to raise the urgency. There are people in high office in this country who are ready to abandon this experiment. After almost 250 years, who don't think that democracy is working or worthwhile, who think that they have their piece of the pie and therefore there's no reason to keep the door open for anyone else. And that to me is just not how, we best honor the people who have worked so hard to create the system that we have and who have worked to protect it at every turn, throughout that history. And I think that's a place where all of us can do better is just in raising up that urgency.
Here, here. Don't forget to take your postcards on the way out. I'm sure Ed can stay for a minute if there's other questions. And next week, they'll all be online at 10 o'clock. A true story of kingpin crime busters, and the birth of the American underworld, the incorruptible